There is a night in August, usually the one right after the hottest and stillest day of the month, when the shallow water along a shoreline stops being a place catfish pass through and turns into a place they hunt. Most people are not there for it. They are asleep or sitting on the wrong bank with a bait that died 3 hours ago. I have watched anglers work August nights for a long time. The ones who do well are almost never the ones with the most tackle in the truck. They understand a few plain things nobody has any reason to sell them. 3 of those things are in here. The oxygen story most anglers have backwards. The fact that you are not fishing for 1 catfish, you are fishing for 4. And a freshness clock running on every piece of cut bait you own. Then 10 baits, and a plan for tonight. Let me start with what August actually does. When a lake takes on heat all summer, the column separates into layers that stop trading with each other. Warm, light water on top, colder, heavier water underneath, and a sharp boundary between them we call the thermocline. Once that sets, the bottom layer stops getting resupplied with oxygen while everything down there keeps breathing. So by late August, in a lot of deeper lakes and reservoirs, the deep water is cold and close to empty. But not every water body does this. Shallow ponds do not stratify the way a 100-foot reservoir does. Rivers do not. Tailwaters do not. A windy lake may stay mixed all summer. So deep lake or reservoir, assume layering until you prove otherwise. Moving water, assume the column is mixed and the fish are not compressed. Now the part that gets repeated wrong constantly. Most anglers believe catfish move shallow at night because oxygen improves after dark. In most productive warm water, oxygen goes the other direction. In daylight, algae and aquatic plants put oxygen into the water. After sunset that stops, but everything in the lake keeps consuming oxygen all night. So dissolved oxygen typically falls through the night and tends to be lowest near dawn. Mississippi State University Extension publishes a guide on water quality of catfish ponds, and this pattern is central to it. Producers do not run aerators in the heat of the afternoon. They run them at night, because night is when respiration outruns photosynthesis. They are aerating in the dark. So why do fish come up onto that flat? Temperature first. Shallow water has less mass, so it sheds heat far faster than the main basin. A mudflat that was punishing at 4 in the afternoon can be genuinely comfortable a few hours after sunset, while the deep water barely moves. The shallows are the only part of your lake that meaningfully changes over a night. And food, second. Crayfish come out, insects fall in, minnows push up to feed, and the fish that eat forage move with it. So the catfish is not chasing oxygen onto that flat. It is following a temperature drop and a dinner bell, in water where oxygen is quietly getting worse the whole time. You will hear people quote a fixed window. 9 at night to 2 in the morning is the usual one. I would not build a night around that, because nothing pins it there. The real window depends on depth, how hot the day was, wind, cloud, current, and how productive the lake is. So here is a procedure instead. Put a cheap thermometer in the top foot of water on your flat before dark, note the temperature and the time, and repeat every hour. What you want is the stretch where that shallow water drops fastest. That is usually when the flat turns on. 3 nights of that and you have a better window for your lake than any general rule. Now the second thing, and this is where most bait advice goes wrong at the root. You are not fishing for a catfish. You are fishing for one of 4 different animals. Channel catfish are the opportunists. Documented stomach contents include the expected forage plus terrestrial insects, fallen fruit off overhanging trees, and a great deal of dead material off the bottom. That is a scavenger with an open mind, and it is the fish scent baits and fresh-cut bait are built for. Blue catfish are the current fish. They relate to moving water, channel edges, and the pathways food travels down, and they lean hard on forage fish. If your water has flow in August, that is where blues make sense, and shad or skipjack is the language they speak. Bullheads thrive exactly where everybody else quits. They handle warm, muddy, low oxygen, soft bottom water better than the others, so that farm pond everyone writes off as too hot and too dead is often full of bullheads feeding fine. They want small, soft, flat on the bottom, and a smaller hook than most people tie on. And then there is the flathead, which is a different animal entirely. Flatheads are ambush predators, and adults feed heavily on live prey. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission describes them plainly as a fish rarely taken on dead bait. They are not cruising a scent trail looking for something that already died. They are sitting in a log jam waiting for something alive to make a mistake. So if you have soaked chicken liver on a flat for years, wondering why you never catch a flathead, you were speaking to the wrong fish. And there is a detail on flatheads that surprised me. The United States Geological Survey, working with Penn State Sea Grant, ran a diet study on invasive flathead catfish in the Susquehanna River Basin in Pennsylvania, DNA barcoding stomach contents from hundreds of fish. The prey that showed up most often was not a fish. It was rusty crayfish, present in roughly a third to a little over 40% of the stomachs, with contents across every size class they examined. Now, straight about what that does and does not mean. That is one study, one invaded river system, with an extremely abundant invasive crayfish available. It is not a national ration for flatheads everywhere, but it should change how you think about flathead bait on a river that has crayfish in it. If everyone on your water runs live bluegill and nothing else, a live crayfish is a signal that fish sees constantly and almost never sees on a hook. That is the kind of edge that never makes it onto a shelf, because nobody can package a crayfish you flipped a rock for. All right, 10 baits, counting down. Number 10, night crawlers. The most underrated August bait there is, and the best bullhead bait on this list. Bullheads and small channel cats eat worms and insects as a core part of their natural diet, so this is not a compromise. It is what they already hunt on a soft bottom in the dark. Use about half a crawler on a size 2 or size 1 bait hook, and go smaller than you think for bullheads. A big circle hook meant for a 20-pound fish is too large for a 7-inch bullhead to get around, and you will take bumps all night and hook nothing. Hook it once through the middle, so both cut ends hang free and move. Cast to soft bottom in 2 to 5 feet, close to the bank. Bullheads sit much closer in than people fish for them. Check every 15 or 20 minutes. The common mistake is a hook that belongs on a different fish, and it can be free. Water a patch of lawn heavily in the evening, and pick them off the grass with a red light after dark. Number 9. Chicken liver, a channel catfish bait more than anything else. Liver is loaded with blood, so it dumps a lot of scent very quickly, and when you are pulling a fish across a dark flat toward you, fast release is what you want. The problem is it falls apart, and in 85-degree water, it turns to mush fast. Use a piece about the size of a large marble on a 2/0 or 3/0 circle hook, and wrap it in a small square of pantyhose, cheesecloth, or gauze pinned to the hook. Scent passes straight through the mesh, and the bait survives the cast and 10 minutes of a bullhead pecking at it. Fish it on flats and mud banks in 2 to 6 feet, and on the shallow side of a drop. Check every 20 minutes. If it has gone pale and the mesh feels empty, nothing is smelling it. The common mistake is leaving it out an hour because nothing bit. In August, nothing biting is often because there is nothing left out there to bite. Number 8. Scored chicken gizzards and chicken hearts. The answer to the liver problem, and hardly anyone uses them. Gizzards are dense muscle. They survive a hard cast and repeated pecking, while still carrying plenty of organ scent. Hearts are tougher than liver, and still blood-rich. Same aisle, same price, far more durable. Here is the part worth getting right. Do not just cut a gizzard in half. Having a round lump adds only a modest amount of surface. Score the outside in a crosshatch, 4 or 5 shallow cuts each way, then cut it into 2 or 3 pieces. That opens the interior in a dozen places without giving up the toughness that made you pick it. Thumb-sized piece on a 3/0 circle. It holds without mesh. This is your patience rod. Set it and let it soak while you work a second rod with something softer. 45 minutes between checks is fine. The common mistake is fishing one hole and unscored, catching nothing, and deciding gizzards do not work. Number 7. Terrestrial insects. Cicadas, grasshoppers, katydids, big beetles. Free, seasonal, and invisible to the tackle industry because there is nothing to sell. Late summer is peak terrestrial season. Insects are at their largest and most numerous. They get blown in, they drop off overhanging limbs, and they end up in the water in real numbers. Channel cats and bullheads both take them, and along a wooded bank that is a large share of what is landing in front of those fish. One large insect, or 2 or 3 grasshoppers threaded on a size 1 or size 2 hook a cicada through the thorax so it stays intact. Cast tight to overhanging trees and brushy banks, not an open mudflat, and check about every 20 minutes. The common mistake is fishing them where nothing is falling in. Location is the whole logic of the bait, and a porch light and a white sheet after dark will fill a jar for nothing. Number 6. Leeches. Overlooked outside the upper Midwest, where most people file them under walleye. They are an excellent bullhead and small to medium channel bait. Tough and lively at once is rare, and movement matters more at night, when a catfish is working with smell, taste, and vibration instead of sight. One leech on a size 1 or size 2 hook, through the sucker end, which is the wider flat end. Not through the middle. Hooked through the middle it balls up and stops swimming, which throws away the only reason you paid for it. Fish soft bottom and weed edges in 1 to 4 feet. An hour between checks is fine. The common mistake is leaving them in warm water in the truck all day. And check your state on collecting or transporting leeches, because that is regulated in some places. Quick pause, because the biggest payoff is coming. If this has already changed how you plan to set up tonight, a like helps it reach somebody about to fish the wrong 5 hours. And if you want reasoning instead of the same 10 tips repackaged every season, subscribe. Number 5. Crayfish. They appear in the documented natural diet of every catfish we have talked about, and in August, they are extremely active after dark, which is exactly when your bait is in the water. You are not imitating forage, you are using it at the hour it is moving. Live crayfish for flatheads and larger channels, hooked through the tail from underneath so it stays alive and kicking, on a 2/0 to 4/0 hook. For channels and bullheads, break the tail off and fish just the tail meat, because the shell on the body blocks a lot of scent. Cast to rocky banks, riprap, current seams, and log jams if you are after flatheads. Check a live one every 30 minutes, tail meat every 20. The common mistake is a whole live crayfish for bullheads that cannot get it in their mouth. Free option, and a good one. Walk a rocky shoreline after dark with a light and a small dip net. Their eyes throw the light straight back at you. 20 minutes gives you a night of bait out of the exact water you are about to fish. Legal note, and this one matters. Rules on collecting crayfish, using them as bait, and above all moving them between water bodies vary enormously by state, and several states restrict or ban it because of invasive crayfish spread. Check your state agency before you gather, and never move live crayfish from one lake to another. Number 4. Commercial punch bait or dip bait. The only manufactured product on this list, and it earns its place for one job. These pastes release a heavy scent cloud fast, and warm August water speeds that up. They shine not as your primary offering all night, but as a search tool. On an unfamiliar bank, punch bait builds a scent field quicker than anything else here. It only works with the right hook. Punch bait needs a ribbed treble, or a sponge hook that gives the paste something to grab. On a plain single hook it slides off during the cast, and you have just chummed a spot 15 feet from where your bait landed. Fan cast a new flat and cover water. Once you get bites in one area, switch to something durable and sit on it. Check every 15 or 20 minutes, because it washes out. The common mistake is treating it as the whole plan instead of the scouting phase. And know the species limit. This is a channel cat product. Blues will take it. Flatheads essentially will not. Now, before the top 3, I owe you the freshness clock, because it changes how you use everything left on this list. Here is what happens inside a piece of cut bait. The moment you cut it, enzymes already in the tissue start breaking proteins down into free amino acids. Then bacteria break those same amino acids down further into ammonia and the compounds that give badly spoiled fish that harsh sour smell. Why does the first stage matter? Because amino acids are among the compounds catfish are most sensitive to. Suzuki and Tucker demonstrated back in 1971 that amino acids act as olfactory stimuli in freshwater catfish, and that finding has held up since. Fresh tissue carries a strong chemical signal, and that is why fresh-cut bait tends to outfish bait thawed and refrozen twice. But I will stop short of where a lot of people take this. There is no magic 2-hour window, because there is no good evidence every cut bait peaks and dies on the same clock. It depends on the species, the size of the piece, the water temperature, the current washing it, and how you stored it. So use signs, not a stopwatch. Keep bait on ice in a small cooler, not in a bucket of lake water, and not in a bag on the tailgate. Enzyme and bacterial activity roughly doubles for every increase of about 18 degrees Fahrenheit, so in August, a cooler is the difference between bait that works at midnight and bait that does not. Cut only what you are about to use, and leave the rest whole and cold. Then change bait when it tells you to. Pale and gray instead of red or pink, soft and mushy instead of firm, no oil on your fingers, washed out and stringy where current has stripped the flesh. Any one of those and it is done, no matter how long it has been out there. And one more that costs nothing. Cut a fresh face on the piece before you recast it. One knife stroke opens fresh tissue and restarts the release. Almost nobody does it. Number 3. Fresh-cut sunfish or sucker, where it is legal. A serious channel and blue catfish bait, with a legal warning that belongs up front rather than buried. In many states, you may only use sunfish you legally caught yourself. Some prohibit them as bait entirely. Some allow suckers but not sunfish. Moving them between water bodies is illegal in a lot of places. Check your state and your specific water body every time, because these rules change lake to lake. Where it is legal, it is devastating, because it is exactly what the catfish in that water are already eating. Cut chunks about 2 inches across for numbers, or use the head for a bigger average fish. Leave the skin on, because that is where a lot of the oil is. 3/0 to 6/0 circle hook, depending on chunk size, and the piece most people throw away is the head. It carries the most concentrated scent of any section, and it screens out small fish, so it is a deliberate choice when you want size over numbers. Cast to flats near a drop and the shallow shelf next to deeper water. Check every 30 to 40 minutes or when it goes pale. The common mistake is cutting it at home in the morning and fishing it at 9 at night. Number 2. Fresh-cut shad or skipjack. The standard everything else gets measured against, and August is when it is at its best, because shad handle heat poorly, and warm water die-offs are common in late summer. In a lot of lakes, catfish are already hunting dead shad on the bottom. You are matching a pattern that is already running. Shad are also extremely oily, and oil behaves differently from a water-soluble scent. It rises. So instead of only laying a trail along the bottom, an oily bait builds a column of scent up through the water, and a fish moving well above your bait can cross it and follow it down. Match the piece to the fish you want. Small chunks and strips bring numbers, including bullheads and small channels. A whole head, or a large fillet section, screens out the small stuff. 4/0 to 7/0 circle hook for the bigger pieces. Cast to current seams, creek mouths, channel edges, and the base of a flat where it starts to drop. Check every 30 minutes, and always cut a fresh face before you send it back out. The common mistake is fishing bait frozen, thawed, refrozen, and thawed again, and then blaming the lake. Free option, throw a cast net at dusk while the light is still good enough to see the school. 20 minutes with a net is the highest return on time in this entire video. Legal note: cast net rules, mesh limits, and which species you may keep as bait vary by state and water body. And if invasive carp are in your system, young carp look a great deal like shad. Several states allow invasive carp as dead or cut bait, but prohibit possessing or moving them alive. Others prohibit possession outright. Look it up before you throw. Number 1. Legal live bait fish for flatheads, and knowing when fresh local cut bait beats it. This is not one bait. It is a decision, and it is worth more than the other 9 combined. If you want a flathead, you need something alive. Where it is legal, that usually means a live sunfish or sucker, 6 to 8 inches, hooked through the back, just behind the dorsal or through the lips, on a 7/0 to 10/0 circle hook, fished tight to wood, undercut banks, log jams and rock, on a heavier rod than you think you need. Flatheads want a struggling meal at their doorstep, not a scent trail to follow across an open flat. But if you are after channels and blues, live bait is often the wrong choice, and fresh local cut bait is the better one. A channel cat in your lake has spent its whole life learning one chemical signature as the smell of an easy meal, and it belongs to the forage that lives in that water. A bag of frozen bait from 3 states away has lost a lot of what made it convincing. Fresh bait out of the water you are standing in is that signal at full strength, and it costs you a cast net and 20 minutes. So the rule is this: alive for flatheads, fresh, local and cut for channels and blues. If you only change one thing tonight, make it that. And all of it depends on your state, which species you may use as bait, whether live bait fish are allowed at all, where you may collect, whether you may transport. Check your state and local regulations before you fish. That is not a disclaimer. It is part of doing this well. Now the rig, because none of these baits matter behind the wrong presentation. A slip sinker rig covers most of what you will do. Egg sinker or no roll sinker on the main line, then a bead, then a barrel swivel, then 12 to 18 inches of leader to the hook. The sinker slides, so a fish can pick the bait up and move off without feeling weight, and feeling weight is the most common reason a catfish drops a bait before you know it was there. Use only as much lead as you need to hold bottom. Use circle hooks at night specifically. In the dark, you are not watching a rod tip, you are hearing a bell or feeling a bump, and your reaction will be late. A circle hook slides to the corner of the mouth and sets itself as the line comes tight, so late is fine. Do not swing on it. Let the rod load, then start reeling. It also tends to hook fish in the jaw instead of deep, which matters if you release anything. Now location. 1 rod shallow, in 2 to 4 feet on a flat or soft mud bank, because that is where channel cats come to feed after dark. A 2nd rod at the edge, where the shallow water starts to fall away. Do not put a rod in the deepest hole you can find. That is the August reflex, because deep feels safe. In a stratified lake, that hole may be nearly empty of oxygen, and you have placed a bait in a part of the lake with no fish in it. And if your water has current at all, fish that instead. Current keeps the column mixed, so nothing gets trapped and nothing gets compressed, and blues in particular stack on those seams. One more thing about shallow water at night, and I want to be careful how I frame it. Because shallow nearshore water loses heat faster than the deeper basin, that cooled water becomes denser and can slide downslope, while surface water moves in to replace it. Moneysmith, Imberger, and Morrison documented convective motions of this kind in the sidearm of a small reservoir, and similar circulation has been seen in other lakes since. I am not going to tell you this happens on every lake on every August night, because it does not. It depends on the shape of the basin, the wind, the cloud cover, and how much the shallows actually cool. But it is worth testing, because the test is free. Toss in something small and natural that floats, a leaf, a twig, a piece of grass, and watch which way it goes. Do it before dark, an hour after dark, and again later. If you are in a sheltered cove on a calm, clear night after a hot day, and the surface is drifting toward the bank with nothing else to explain it, you may be watching that circulation setup. If so, put 1 bait higher on the slope and 1 lower, and let the fish tell you which end of the flat they are working. Write it down and see whether it repeats. That is how you build knowledge of a piece of water nobody can sell you and nobody else on that bank has. All right, here is the plan for tonight. Bring a small cooler with ice, not a bucket, a cooler. Bring 2 baits, not 10. 1 durable scent bait and 1 fresh cut bait. Scored gizzards and fresh cut shad is a strong pair. Night crawlers and fresh cut sunfish, where legal, is another. Rig 2 rods. Slip sinker, bead, swivel, 12 to 18 inches of leader, circle hook size to the bait. 2/0 to 3/0 for organ baits and worms, 4/0 to 7/0 for cut bait, larger for live bait. Set 1 rod shallow on the flat or bank edge, the other at the drop-off or a current seam. If you only have 1 rod, fish a spot for 20 to 30 minutes and then move it. That is your entire search pattern. Keep a note on your phone: time, depth, bait, and how many touches in each 20 to 30-minute block. 3 nights of that, and you will see your own pattern, and it will be more accurate than anything I can tell you, because it is about your lake. Set your whole spread while it is still light: rod holders, net, pliers, knife, headlamp, bait cut and iced. Doing that at 11 at night, one-handed with a flashlight in your teeth, is how gear ends up in the water. Use a red headlamp, and use it as little as you can. Red light preserves your night vision, and every time you flood a shallow flat with white light, you have announced yourself to fish that came in there because it was dark. Wear a life jacket if you are in a boat. Keep your cutting area clean, bag your scraps, and handle and release fish according to your local rules. And watch the weather rather than the calendar. The best August night is usually the one after a hot, still day, because that shallow water has been stacking heat all afternoon and sheds it fast once the sun drops. A cool, overcast day does not build the same contrast, and the night after it is softer. So there it is, small and soft for bullheads, durable and scent-heavy for channels, forage fish and current for blues, alive and tight to cover for flatheads. And underneath all of it, one idea worth more than any bait on the list. August does not shut catfish down. It narrows when and where they can feed, and it splits them by species more sharply than any other month. The angler who understands that is fishing a real window, while everyone else stands around telling each other the lake is dead. Now I want 2 things from you. First, has anyone here ever caught a flathead on dead bait? The agency literature says it is rare, and I know somebody in the comments has a story. Second, and this is the one I am actually curious about. On your best night this summer, which end of the flat did the bites come from? The shallow upper end or down near the drop? Tell me which, and whether the wind was blowing. I read them. And if enough of you answer, we will all know something about that pattern that none of us knows right now.